Hi, my name is Marcus, and this is a companion podcast for the C.G. Jung Helpdesk meetup group. I host live events on Zoom every 2 weeks about the concepts and ideas of the Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung. Every event, I give a presentation about the Jungian concept, so have fun with this event's topic.
I want to welcome you wholeheartedly to a very special topic that got generated out of an earlier event. So the topic is evil, and the history for the reason for the event is that I did last summer an event about shadow and projection. And of course, the discussion pretty quickly turned into the question of evil. And people had some really tough questions about, okay, what are Jung's thoughts about evil, what it means, and like what the logic is behind it. So I put this topic off for a long time because it's not something that he talks about so much directly, but he talks about it indirectly in many instances. So this is like a good point to start. Like if you want to check out an earlier episode, it's about shadow and projection. And if you're, let's say, interested in general about the ethics of Jung and what his worldview was, I can really highly recommend his seminar on Zarathustra. So he did a multi-year seminar on First Spoke Zarathustra from Friedrich Nietzsche. And it's 1,500 pages, I would recommend. But it gives a pretty unique view in Jung's understanding about evil, but also his ethics and how he thinks that the world should work in certain places, because it's a tough topic when you talk about Nietzsche. But first, let's start with some definitions, like what are the core characteristics or hallmarks for Jung in context of evil when he talks about evil. The first thing is like there is not one great definition because it's hard to get very concrete, all-encompassing definitions from Jung for his concepts and his ideas, but rather he's pointing out evil, like saying that certain things are evil or should be labeled as evil. Like a red thread for him is destructive. As soon as something is destructive, he says automatically it's evil. There's something evil lurking behind it when it has not a creative function, but rather a destructive function. He also places evil very inside the psyche. It means evil comes from within. It does not come from the outside into people, that people are pure and everything is fine and good and they're a blank slate, and everything that could bring them to do evil things is things that they have learned or seen outside, but rather just as a psychological fact, there is a force within the psyche that is evil and does evil things and creates evil things. And this is, of course, another very Jungian thing to say, okay, there is some autonomous psychic factor at play that has a worldview, that has goals, that acts through human beings to create or establish something in the world that people are not aware of, that it is existing independently of the person. And I have a good quote that clarifies this further. The famous definition which optimistic people give about evil, that evil is nothing but the absence of good, is only a mistake. But when one looks at the way things develop in the world, one sees that the devil is really in things, that there is an abysmal evil at work. One cannot explain the destructive tendency of the world by the mere absence of good or mistake. Because this is a pretty Christian understanding that like shadow is the absence of light, that evil is the absence of good. And he says, no, it's this whole independent thing, and it's doing its whole independent work. And that ties into another Jungian idea, which is that of the duality. Jung characterizes and describes a lot of things in the world as dualities, like conscious, unconscious, male, females, eros, logos, anima, animus. And the same with good and evil. He says there is a good and there is an evil, and between them there is tension. And it's not that evil is the absence of good, then it would not be its own thing, but rather it's a completely own thing. There's something like this pure evil. There's just also something characteristic of Jung is to emphasize the natural way of things. So Jung emphasizes very often the natural state of things and how there's just an internal logic, a thing, how things should be. And this influences very much how human beings behave, how they develop, and how things should be. And I have some quotes again from Jung. I found really many good quotes for this topic, which is, we have the Christian prejudice against the animal in man, but an animal is not devil, just as it is not good. We are evil. Man is necessarily evil because he is so good. Only domesticated animals misbehave. A wild animal never misbehaves. It follows its own natural law. There is no such thing as a good tiger that only eats apples and carrots. A wild animal is fierce, law-abiding being who fulfill the will of God in the most perfect way. And this goes into this idea of the nature of things. And he draws a pretty clear distinction between, okay, animals just follow instincts and they themselves are not necessarily bad, but there's something in concert with human beings that creates or facilitates evil. And the second quote is, what one calls black magic would be the application of some occult process or power for a power purpose, for the purpose of influencing people, for instance. If one practices yoga with the purpose of producing a certain result, no matter whether it works good or evil, it is black magic. It is done with an evil purpose. It is a power purpose when you want to produce an effect which is really beyond your scope. If you try to give a better impression of yourself than what you really are, which we are always doing, it is a power purpose. Again, there's a natural way how things should be, and counteracting against it can create evil. And he sees it then again in, let's say, destructive way, as the consequences could be forming there. Things coming up from the unconscious, instincts. These are the lower parts, let's say lower parts, but deeper parts of the psyche, and where the creative forces are coming from, but also the independent forces, such as evil. And one distinction that he makes, that things can look evil, but in a way can be misunderstood by being, let's say, unsophisticated. He sees this really in how sophisticated things are. So Jung, there's another idea, like you can do things very archaic, or you can be very sophisticated. If you're interested in another person and want to get close and intimate, there's like a very brutish and archaic way how to do it. And there are laws that punish such behavior. And then it can be sophisticated. There can be courtship, there can be marriage, there can be a relationship. And of course, this archaic, undifferentiated, uncultivated behavior is automatically seen as evil. And this is also why he has another quote: when instinct emerges, so does evil. So the potential is automatically there to go into a certain direction, but to do it in a bad way, to be part in that badness. But at the same time, this is how everything comes up from the psyche. He sees the psyche as structured, you as with your consciousness, with the things you know, things you can do, things that are related to you. And at the same time, below you have the unconscious, with the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious, where you have human nature. Basically, everything that comes into consciousness has to come out of unconscious. And the standard way is just to be overwhelmed and confused about the things that come out of the unconscious and not knowing what to do with it. When the body is eating something completely foreign, completely new, that might not know how to deal with it. And this gives the impression that the things that are coming from down below, from the unconscious, seem unreasonable, archaic. Like emotions can be overwhelming, and unknown emotions especially, or unknown situations can seem destructive and evil and just overwhelming all in all. And this is very often where this idea with shadow comes into play. So he talks about shadow and bad things, because this is where people very often take their bad things. He says modern people are so civilized and, let's say, domesticated, that they push off all the bad things into the unconscious or the places where they don't want to look, which automatically gathers them at a certain place. And this place he calls the shadow, the things that are ignored. But the shadow is not only the bad parts or the evil parts. This would be, let's say, more a Freudian idea to say, okay, we have things coming up, they get evaluated, it's not so good, we put them in the wastebasket. And for Freud, that's the unconscious. But for Jung, there's more, because all the good things about you that you're not aware of and you have not integrated, or that are completely new to you, they're also in the unconscious. For him, it means unconscious potential. And very often also potential that you do not know how to use. So you burn yourself with the fire because you don't know how to deal with the fire. You can do good things with fire. You can cook, you can make light, but you can also burn yourself horribly. Again, this degree of sophistication, how you can deal with that. When we look into the shadow, he says, yeah, evil things seem to come from the shadow, but at the same time, your unconscious is represented very often by a singular person. He says, you're looking into the unconscious as is would be one thing, because that's the only thing you can perceive. Again, perception is a conscious thing, and the unconscious is completely muddled, completely dark, which then again means you do not recognize it completely. In the sense, this is just a standard phenomena. You look, and everything you see then is first your shadow. But behind the shadow, which is the personal unconscious, you have the collective unconscious with all the other forces. And as soon as you, let's say, integrate your personal shadow by integrating the things you know, by recognizing them and facilitating them, you encounter the collective unconscious of the anima and the animus. And he says, the anima and the animus create way more evil and are way more destructive than the shadow, because they are closer to instincts. They are closer to those really primal forces that guide lives and guide even culture. Because he says there is really a psychological distortion happening. He says that very often about the anima, that she pulls the wool over the face of people, that it just distorts how the way really is, because the world is perceived through the anima, not directly. So there's a lot of archaic things coming up, complicated things coming up, but there is something to, let's say, create order and bring sophistication into it, and that's consciousness. This is what consciousness does. This separating, this bringing order, this connecting, this facilitating, right? Jung brings this example very often. When you have a river and it just runs normally, the ingenious nature of human beings is able to facilitate the power of the water that's flowing anyways and doing something else productive with it. For example, you can have like a power plant there that's powered by water, and then bring light into the night and warm up things and all these things. So it's this facilitation of forces that are already there in the psyche. This is done by consciousness for Jung. And there he says that makes morality and moral behavior grounded in consciousness, because consciousness, this is will. Only within consciousness we have free will. We can decide to do things or we can decide not to do things. And this then separates us from animals, because animals, they cannot decide, they just are. But human beings can decide. And this means human beings have the potential to act differently, to act in a more civilized, culturalized, sophisticated manner. And if they not do it, that of course goes on their conscious. And he describes it like this: all evil comes from ignorance. All evil, the entire sum of life, comes from not knowing. We will find this doctrine in the original words of the Buddha. For whoever is in the state of consciousness behaves like an automaton. He has no ethic. So animals acting according to instincts, that's okay. But human beings, as we could be something more, consciousness-wise, we have unique duty. And he has this very nice example. When we talk about the functions, right? There are 4 functions: sensation, thinking, feeling, and intuition. And all of them can be trained like a muscle. And you can have very archaic feeling, for example. And he says, very archaic feeling is described by just saying, is something good for me or something bad for me? Like, for example, I steal the wife of my neighbor. That's good for me, so it's a good thing. My neighbor steals my wife. I feel bad. That means it's a bad thing. This, of course, is very archaic. There's not really an overarching morality that brings together societies and holds groups together, but rather it's then extremely person-driven. And you have this for all the functions, but this is what he means. Like, okay, in what degree of sophistication do you see this? The highest form is for him, and this is part of individuation, to be able to sacrifice. And he says, you can only sacrifice the things you have. And you can only sacrifice yourself when you have yourself. So bad things happening can be good and is necessary for transformation. And this is already a sophisticated idea, the sign of a sophisticated consciousness. If it can endure this and transform itself and go through this very dark valley. At the same time, he says, of course, not only the bad things come from the unconscious. Again, this would be a Freudian idea, but also positive things come from the unconscious. So conscious as this nagging voice that tells one that one has done something wrong or should do better, also comes from the unconscious. He sees there really the self that's telling people, okay, what they can be or what they could not be. And at the same time, we have an instinct for making laws that form then the basis of moralities. And human beings are just law creating beings. And that's just what we do. And we have also this conscious part of us that reminds us of the things where we fall short. So, but things come up, and this can also be very attractive. And there's another quote. We all know that evil, especially if not scrutinized too closely, can be very attractive. And most of all, when it appears in an idealistic garb. So Jung lived through the First World War and Second World War. And of course, he encountered a lot of isms like fascism and communism and all these great horrors that really created a lot of destruction and just destroyed lives. So he had very clear ideas what it means when a huge group is swayed by an idea or emotion and just goes with it. And he saw a lot of evil in the modern nation state, but at the same time, he was living in central Switzerland as a Swiss guy. So of course, big countries, big governments have then a very unique feeling. But Jung is more on an individualistic way, which means he's very suspicious of big groups. And this was around the time when really big organized groups came up and wreaked havoc on the world. So when we talk about symbolization of evil and how it looks like, for example, in a dream and vision or fantasies, they are very old symbols. And I chose this as a picture for the event. And this is, of course, the color black, but also this snake-like texture and snakes and dragons and all these things as the markers of the things that are evil. It's like even in the Bible, the snake is evil. And here he sees a unique Western point of view, because in the Western world, the dragon needs to be killed. Like St. George is famous because he killed a dragon, and St. Patrick is famous because he killed all the snakes and dragons. But in the East, as people know, the dragon is a very positive sign, rather a bringer of luck and somebody you can have a good relationship with it. I once heard the story. Nixon went to China on a trip, and they gifted to him a huge dragon statue and put it into his hotel room. And he said he could not sleep the whole night because his dragon was looking at him. So they wanted to do something nice, like give him the nice dragon, the positive dragon. And he, of course, as a Westerner, was rather scared and would not sleep. But if you look at the symbolization, and I said this before, like things are coming up and they seem unwieldy and they cannot be integrated into consciousness and it's not clear how to deal with them. It means there's also potential there to transform something, which means not everything is necessarily bad when it comes out, but when it manifests in this archaic way, it is bad, it is evil, but it then transforms. This is another Jungian idea, this idea of transformation, change, of turning something into that like basic into something higher. This was why he was interested in alchemy, taking a base metal and make it gold through a process. Is the things that he saw happening in the psyche, what we are doing. We're taking, let's say, archaic emotions, instincts, and we can bring them into a very fulfilling relationship and society or friendship or life through the things that we do and the things we decide to pursue. And he encountered that the most, and he talks about it the most in the context of dreams. So when dreams present the sleeper with content from the unconscious, which is basically autonomous fantasies coming up, confronting the dreamer, they present themselves also in a possibly negative way. And everybody had bad dreams before, but it would not be Jung if he were not saying, there's something positive in this dream because it's telling you something. And that's the next quote. When you dream of an evil animal chasing you, of an evil dog or wild bull, you can always be absolutely sure that you are somehow separated from instinct and have reached a contradictory situation. You are not at one with the view taken by nature, and hence nature turns against you. For Jung, consciousness is always something that builds up, that's integrating a lot of stuff, but then gets blind for the rest of the world because you have to focus to build something up and you ignore all the rest. And in the bad case, if you ignore something too much, your psyche will push against consciousness to bring attention to it. And this kind of fantasy or this kind of dream is something, of course, extreme, a wild animal chasing you, like a bull or a snake or an elephant or anything. For Jung, that symbolizes there's an instinct being ignored. And even the type of animal tells you something about what kind of instinct get ignored. And when you encounter a snake or a dragon, this is really something very low in the psyche, something very deep, very ancient, because we have a reptile part brain, this part of the brain that's so incredibly old, long before human beings existed, that we share it still with reptile animals that exist today. And another quote, one often has dreams which seem destructive and evil, the thing one cannot accept, but it's merely due to the fact that one's conscious attitude is wrong. If one says, it seems quite black, but perhaps I must accept it, instantly the thing changes color. It becomes compatible with consciousness. And this is an interesting point, because this is what he's done in a therapy practice. When he had a patient, he first would walk through the whole life of the patient, like, okay, what's your background? What's your history? What's your relationships? What are you interested? So exploring consciousness, everything that you know about yourself, tell me about it. And once that was exhausted, he would turn to the dreams of the patient and see, okay, how do the dreams react to that? Because the unconscious reacts to consciousness. Specific things that you have in your consciousness of that you say or you do create a reaction within you. And that can be also like a moral conscious, then saying, okay, what you're saying, that's not completely true. You do not believe that, or that's, you know that this is not right. And this you can ignore during the waking hours because you're basically flooded with outside stimuli. But when you sleep, these things come up and then they're presented to you. And this is then the things that you're potentially running away from. But you have to encounter them. You have to build a relationship with them, not kill the dragon, but befriend it. And at the same way, this changes the perception. And you would use it as a diagnostic tool to check how well the therapy would be going and how the development of the patient was. So he would uncover new material in the dreams, talk with the patient about it to help them integrate it into consciousness, because paying attention is already a form of integration. And this again changes the dreams, because the dreams and the unconscious is now reacting to new conscious contents. And there the relationship can be that it then turns. The evil animal turns into something benign, like a domestic animal, something you can interact with more easily. And he has this example of soldiers who served in the war and got traumatized by that. And he said that's a very bad sign when you dream of things 100% how they happened in the external world, because it's unconscious in the psyche, which is symbolic and works with analogs. When it produces this kind of fantasies, there's something very strictly wrong. So if you dream of a situation one by one that happened like that, that's a very bad sign for you. And he would talk with the soldiers through their problems. And when they were shell shocked, for example, when just explosives around them turning up and killing their friends and hurting them, through the therapy that would change from a loud noise explosion, for example, to a loud lion. And this is already a huge improvement, because you can interact with a lion, but you cannot interact just with the noise. And with time, then the lion would be turned into a cat. And this is then this integration part, and also change of attitude to willfully confront the bad things, because this is where potentially value is. The future of oneself lies in one's own unconscious, and it gets revealed through time and through experience. And this is why it says, like, you have to focus on the bad and evil parts. You cannot just put it into the wastebasket, but realize, okay, this is part of me and I need to find a way how to deal with it and do it in a good way. And this is like the moral burden that we have with our consciousness and the potentiality. But of course, what people like to do is a mechanism he calls repression. This comes from psychoanalysis. And this means, okay, I do not like it. I don't want to deal with it. So I just ignore it and push it down. Of course, for Jung, nothing stays down. If you ignore it, it grows stronger just to get your attention. And the more you ignore it, the stronger it will try to get your attention. But it would not be Jung if he would say repression is always bad. He says repression is also good in certain circumstances. For example, when you're very young and you're not able to integrate all these things, then it's first the best step to ignore them and repress them and come back later when you're able to deal with them. He says that there's especially for young people, like he said, young people should not deal with the unconscious. They should deal with the world, establish themselves there. The unconscious will come later. And he says at the same time, the psyche is smart and tells you when you're not able to digest something. It comes out of the unconscious, but it's too strange, too weird, too archaic, too forceful, the fact that you cannot deal with it is a sign that you should not interact with it in the moment. Of course, when your life comes to a standstill because you don't do it, then you have to encounter it. But otherwise, he says it's the same with the body. When the body eats something that is not good for it, it will puke and try to get rid of it. And the psyche does the same with certain contents. And if we look, for example, now in the development of civilizations, he said, yeah, it's like in the beginning, you should put things into pretty clear categories so that you can focus on something stable, that you create an island in a wild ocean. And he sees the East more sophisticated in the views of the internal world and the psychological world. And this is why they can interact with the dragon, because they have the cultural institutions for that and traditions, in contrast to the West, where he said this is way newer in a cultural sense, because in the East, in India, for example, we have 5,000 years, also in China. And in Europe, we have very fragmented 2,000 years or maybe a little bit more. So he says for development, this is also necessary to repress things. So every time with Jung, everything is a little bit more complicated and you have to see it from two sides. And of course, as I said, you repress something, you ignore something, it goes into the shadow. But at the same time, he says, it doesn't stay there really. It creeps out. Because the things that you are unconscious about and the things you don't want to see in yourself, you will start to see in other persons. This is why I made the event back then shadow and projection, because this is necessarily what comes out of that. When you ignore these parts, you will see them projected onto the world. So you still have to contend with them. You cannot really run away. You will not see that they're really inside you, but you will see that they are basically around you. This is why people can get a strong feeling of hatred to other persons that they might not even know, but still they have this feeling. And very likely there's something triggered within their unconscious that reminds them of the parts that they pushed into the unconscious. And they see it in another person, of course, hate it. And some amazing quotes for that. So the evil of which we are unconscious in ourselves will be insinuated into the surroundings, and there it will work. And this is also not such a good thing. When one tries desperately to be good and wonderful and perfect, then all the more the shadow develops a definite will be black and evil and destructive. People cannot see that. They are always striving to be marvelous. And then they discover that terrible, destructive things happen which they cannot understand. And they either deny that such facts have anything to do with them, or they admit them. They take them for natural afflictions. So they try to minimize them and to shift the responsibility elsewhere. And the next quote, a person may contain a devil in their unconscious, for instance, an evil part of his personality. Then in his vicinity, there is someone who is that devil. And an unconscious person is much more relieved when someone else takes over that role, so that he can believe himself to be perfectly nice and decent. That is the reason why we appreciate detective stories and movies that demonstrate crime and bad people. We love villains. We read stories of their lives with great interest. You find the life of Al Capone, say, very fascinating, simply because he represents certain contents of our own unconscious. As long as I am such conditioned that a brother or an aunt or somebody else represents the devil to me, I can live peacefully. My unconscious is sufficiently expressed. And this, of course, is something very bad when it's not happening on a personal level, let's say, but also on a nation state level. And this is what he sees in a big part in the 20th century happening, that suddenly the country right next to you is very evil, and this is where all the evil people are. Or there are certain groups within your society that are evil. And this is the stuff that people do not want to deal with themselves and then project onto others. And this can, of course, snowball into bigger things once you're in a group. So this is why we basically need to contend with evil tendencies or these archaic forces within ourselves, because otherwise that has real world consequences, not only for us, but also for other people. And this repression can manifest itself also in another way. And this is interesting. For example, when people are very focused on their persona, okay? The persona is being how you're perceived and presenting yourself in society, in a group, your status, your role that you fulfill, which of course is always a reduced version of a person. It's not a complete person. The things that you do not do in your persona role you will all live out in your personal life. So he says that very often, that you have perfectly nice guys in society that do dutiful their duty and all these things, but at home, with a personal relationship with a partner, for example, then all hell breaks loose. So it's like you cannot ignore, you have to integrate everything, you have to contend with everything. Only then you're a complete human being, and only then, let's say, this onslaught stops. This is why you can't run away. This is why you have to face the evil, basically. And another interesting thing that he talks about, and is he really interested in, is the thing that he calls primitive psychology. Primitive, I'm using the word that he used, can have, of course, negative connotations, but we would today say pre-scientific or hunter-gatherer or superstitious psychology, the state of mind. And he says, this is how we all operate deep inside of us, that we have layers of civilizations on top, but they're not really that thick. Deep down, we still operate like that. For example, when we sleep, it's the same psychology as human beings have been for hundreds, thousands of millions of years. And he says there, the understanding of psychology was not there, this awareness. So things were called differently. For example, if somebody is taken over by a strong emotion or a strong instinct, the understanding was there was an evil spirit within them that possessed them. And that there were this whole rituals and traditions around how to deal with spirits that could take you over and force you to do things that you do not want to do with bad consequences. So the understanding for Jung was rather that consciousness was, like in young children, rather weak and easily overwhelmed by emotion. But at the same time, there was so much awareness to see, okay, this is not good if I lose control. So this is why I said in these pre-scientific societies, superstitious societies, people are extremely polite because they don't want to provoke the devil and the other person. Also, I said there were like ghost houses placed in front of villages where ghosts would get trapped. Instead than going to the persons in the real houses, they would go into small houses, and that you basically have to get rid of the ghost. So you have exorcism in a way to leave the body of the person. So we would say, okay, they have a neurosis, they have a complex, but the idea back then was rather, oh, it's a spirit, it's a ghost. And we have that sometimes even in metaphors, we still use it. So like metaphors have a very good view into the psychological understanding, because it's very often pictures, and this is how the unconscious works and how the old parts of our psychology works. When you've done something bad and somebody points it out, then that you say, I don't know which devil wrote me. We say that in Germany, for example, which goes then back to this idea of like something possessing you from the outside, some kind of demon, some kind of ghost. And this brings me to Christianity, another big topic that Jung talked about, because it was already this attempt to establish a certain type of consciousness. And Friedrich Nietzsche, I mentioned at the beginning, he did not say a lot of positive things about Christianity. He called it the slave mentality, but he attributed one positive thing with it. And he said, really forming, educating the mind and disciplining the mind. So for Jung, that also means, okay, this is like an early attempt. These are the first ways of interacting with the psyche, for example, and bringing order into there. That means things get repressed and put into a box. And the box is, of course, the devil and demons and so on. And then everything which is not Christianity, which is not this orderly structure, then, of course, is the devil. This is why the devil, for example, looks like he does, because he's similar to all these nature gods that existed before, for example, for Pan or other things. So everything pagan, of course, turned to the devil, because seen from the viewpoint of Christianity, it's the bad things you do not want to contend with, because you have the good thing already, which is a, let's say, early position, just to draw very clear lines. So a lot of things, and I did not know that, deal also in Christianity around this of getting rid of evil things. For example, an altar in a church, it needs to be cleaned with oil, with special oil, where the nature spirits are pushed aside and out of the building. So things get cleaned to get rid of nature, of get rid of the pagan and material things of the material world. Of course, there can be situations where this does not really work, to say, okay, these are the good things. Yeah, I'm trying to find a way how to integrate it, but this is something I found interesting, and then I will just read it. The French peasants in the 13th century worshipped the devil. There was a prolonged period of black plague, wars, etc., and since their prayers to the good God were perfectly useless, since he didn't help and disaster pursued them, they began to celebrate the Black Mass. They reversed the Christian rite to the worship of Satan. Interesting. I did not know that. But there's a point in there that Jung emphasizes a lot. He argued later in his life a lot with Christian scholars because he wrote this book, Answer to Job, where they basically said he did not understand Christianity. And they said, well, I do not completely, and I can't say everything about it, but I see it from a psychological point. And he talks about the fact that God cannot be all good. Because if he would be all good, he could not be all powerful. And if he is all powerful, he can't be only good. And he said the modern understanding of God is something that's only positive. But he said, no, it can't be. It also needs to be negative. And this goes back to this idea to saying evilness and bad things is not the absence of good. It's its own thing. And you need basically both things. And when you say there is something that is everything, it has to encompass both. And he said, this is the modern understanding, which is incomplete to saying that God is only good and only positive. So that would be all the things I could find regarding evil and things that Jung talked about in regards to evil, which was a lot more than I anticipated. But thank you for listening, and I hope you learned something. And when you encounter something evil, think about how Jung saw it, which is always a positive thing. This is something I really like about Jung. He's very open and he's very positive. Like even the very bad things, there's still potential it can transform in something better, that this is your future, that this is the way to go. And it makes no sense to ignore and not to confront. And I think this is what draws a lot of people to Jung, that in its art and in the understanding, it's very open, it's very positive, it's transformative, it's not finite. So yeah, that would conclude my presentation part. Thank you for listening.
This was this event's topic. Thanks for tuning in. During an event, a discussion part follows after the presentation where all attendees discuss the just presented topic or other Jungian concepts. If you also want to join, find the group on meetup.com. The name of the group is CG Jung Helpdesk. Also make sure to subscribe to the podcast on the platform of your choice. See you next time.